Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of No One's a Critic. I'm Kino, joined as always by Mac. How you doing this week, Mac?
I'm good. Just got off a long day of work, and I'm nursing a sinus infection that is finally going away. But for some reason, I have no smell or taste. Yeah. Oh, it's not COVID though. I've had I took like 2 or 3 tests, not COVID. But yeah, apparently that can happen with sinus infections if it gets bad enough. It can, and I don't know if I sound stuffed up a little bit still. But apparently it can like affect your, I don't know what exactly, but yeah. So I cannot smell or taste anything, which has pros and cons. But
Yeah. No, that's the one thing I was worried about during COVID. I was literally the only thing I was worried about was like it wasn't dying, it was losing my sense of taste. Because I knew people who actually lost their sense of taste for like years. And I was like, oh shit, that would suck. Because that's like,
okay, well don't get me scared. Don't
well,
get
no,
me scared.
you don't have COVID. You have a sinus infection. Those
Yeah,
go away.
I don't think it's COVID. But it's been a couple days and it hasn't come back, so I'm kind of getting nervous. Um, I'm sure it'll be fine. If another week goes by, I'll go to the doctor, but
Yeah. Oh well, hopefully it doesn't turn into anything serious.
I don't think
Um,
so.
yeah, this week has been interesting. It's been very busy. We actually had to delay this a couple of times. The first time it was my fault. I just delayed it because I was just like exhausted. I was just like I was just too tired to record a podcast because we usually record on, like a Friday night after working for a week.
Yeah.
So that one was on me, and then we delayed again because I just went out of town. We
Oh, yeah,
went to
where'd you go?
Reno, went to Reno for
Ooh,
the weekend. Which I don't know if you're familiar with, like it's like the smaller kind of shittier version of Vegas.
it's Vegas's dirty cousin.
Yeah, Vegas is like smaller, less famous cousin. It's like there's two centers of gambling in Nevada. There's Vegas, and then there's Reno, and Reno's the smaller one. So we
My
went there. It's in like northern Vegas. No, not northern, no, northern Nevada. But anyway, we just went there for the weekend. Hung around, drank, ate food, ate way too much, and then we're back and now we're recording the podcast.
nice. My only actual my only like actual reference to Reno is Reno 911, which is a show that like I didn't appreciate when I remember like I used to like when I was younger I'd watch it um because it would be on Comedy Central. And so like South Park and then Reno 911. And I didn't appreciate it until I got older and I rewatched it. I'm like, this is shit fucking gold. I love this.
Yeah, I've only seen like maybe like parts. I think you're right. I think I only watched it after South Park came on, or whatever. Like whenever the show led into it from Comedy Central. But yeah, it seemed like like one of those type of funny office type shows like that.
Yeah, probably. I might actually have to like give it a. Maybe I'll end up doing a retrospective video on it because I'm sure like rewatching it would be very interesting. But
First, you got to finish the one you've been working on.
yes, the Hannibal video. Well, it ended up being way longer than I expected. It's running at 2 hours and 19 minutes right now. Yeah, well, I thought the fucking Avatar one went longer than I expected, and this one, well, it's because it turns out as I was researching um, the conception of the Hannibal Lecter series, I guess you could say, um, I stumbled upon a like insane true account, true true crime, not true crime, but like true life series of events that basically it surrounded the making of the entire Hannibal Lecterverse as we know it, all the films, the books, and it's insane. It's like it's very. I couldn't not talk about it. So there's a whole section of the video that kind of adds that, and that changed how I restructured the rest of it. So yeah, it'll probably be. I think this is going to end up being my third longest video.
Yeah,
So
well, that's awesome. I can't wait to hear that story when I watch the video.
yeah, so hopefully in the next month or so. But um, speaking of which, an analysis and whatnot, um, I think we were going to speak about it. I know we were talking on Twitter, and I retweeted something about the dreaded term media literacy, and how it has become a sort of pretentious buzzword among some. And yeah, I'm curious about talking about this because I'm sort of torn. I think I saw your perspective, um, but also I think that the term does have its place and maybe is like it is used incorrectly, but I think it is often derided. It's like sometimes like I think sometimes people throw the baby out with the bathwater with it. They kind of write it off completely. So, but yeah,
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm hoping this will be an interesting topic because I have a feeling it's one of those things that's like when you actually examine it, I wonder if the issue falls apart. But let's talk about it because we did get into a little, not even argument, a little disagreement on Twitter over that thing, which was um media literacy. For those that don't know, is like this term that's been. I mean, it's a concept and a term that's existed for a long time, but it's been used online recently in discourse about whether or not you kind of really understand a work or not, whether you actually understand what a subject is about. I don't like the term because like I'm pretty sure literacy solely refers to like books and like the written word,
yeah,
which there's a lot that could be said about that. Like we use the term like video essay. I don't know if that's probably not a super accurate term. Um, but in essence, like, does that sound right? Is that what media literacy means? It's like
I
having
think
like an actual understanding of the work.
yeah, I think the better or a good way to compare it is because I used to have this when I was in high school. We had a whenever we would have tests, and I don't know if this is universal for everybody, but at least in my high school, when we would have English tests, the term they would use about like certain passages was reading comprehension, which basically was you would read a passage or a story and they would ask you and like it sounds almost weird to put a term to something that to many people is kind of common sense, but basically it's like, okay, so what is the author trying to say? What is the lesson of this piece? What is the theme? What is the, you know, are they utilizing irony? Are they utilizing, you know whatever. um and so yeah, so it's really just another word I think for like it kind of is just another word for analysis, I guess, in a way. Yeah, so in and of itself, the term is kind of weird. Um, but I guess then the question becomes, okay, but then what happens when we come across certain media or certain pieces of media that are notoriously, I don't want to say misinterpreted, but that maybe what's the word I'm looking for? Inspire a number of different interpretations. So for something like, are you like if you've watched like a David Lynch film, a film where like all the events are very, um, you know, ambiguous and nothing is really explained. So it's like, okay, that's something where people can, give their own thoughts and give their own theories, and that's fun. Um, but then you get to stuff where it becomes a lot more contentious. Probably one that always speaks to me and like kind of is always relevant is Fight Club, and we did an episode on that, so we probably know that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's interesting. Yeah, so I agree with you. Like when you try to like put words to it, it sounds super simple, but like obviously media can mean more than what it first appears on the surface, right? Like I don't know why this example pops into mind, but like Animal Farm, right? It's like it's a story
of course.
about talking animals on a farm, but there's this kind of very obvious allegory that it's meant to represent something more than that. And that's not the only thing it can represent. But that's just like one example that pops into mind. So work can mean more than what it appears on the surface. But why this issue is so controversial is part of the ongoing culture war stuff. We're going to be talking about culture war stuff on this episode because that's really why this issue has become why this buzzword has become annoying. It's been used by at least to someone like me. Mac might disagree, but it's been used by people to basically be like, you don't understand this work, like, and it's usually used for stuff that's like, a great like example is like Breaking Bad, uh like the whole Skylar White thing. Skylar White is this character that is hated by a portion of the audience and is defended by a different portion of the audience. And a lot of people are like, well, if you don't like Skylar White, you didn't understand Breaking Bad, right? You're not supposed to identify with what Walt's doing. You're not supposed to like what he's doing. It's obviously bad stuff, and the terms used by people to kind of to have this kind of superiority over other people. It's like, I have media literacy, you don't. You're just like a dumb pleb who doesn't understand work. And I don't disagree that there are people who are dumb and don't understand things, or they come away with an interpretation that I wouldn't come away with. But I really don't. It's just so smug and pretentious the way people are using it nowadays, and I just don't like that. It really gets under my skin.
Yeah, because I think I see what you mean because um, from what I've seen and kind of because I've kind of seen the other side where what I've seen is there's sort of like a hostile pushback towards it, towards that, like that's sort of like people trying to like imply or trying to like imprint things onto media, and to some extent I agree because like obviously there's the big what's the saying, your English teacher, oh, the curtains are blue because it represents depression, and the author's like, no, they're fucking blue because I don't know. So yeah, so there does, I think media literacy, it does reach a certain, um, it kind of crosses a threshold, the pretentiousness threshold, when you start getting people who like yeah, like to your point, that they're trying to like make themselves superior, and like it's like, oh, I understand it and you don't. Um, However, from my perspective, and I agree with that, but I think from my perspective, what I was mostly exposed to was people rebelling against that. But instead of just rebelling against that and calling those people out, there were people who sort of like took it too far in the other direction and like almost d- any sort of like looking in where it became to the point where it was like almost like borderline anti-intellectualism, where like it would be a person who would unironically say, like, why are you trying to like imprint your political beliefs onto Animal Farm? It's just a book about animals. It's like, well, okay, hang on. That's a little like, no, there's like, yeah. So there's the middle ground there where it's like, it's like, okay, let's not go too far into like, sniffing our own farts and like, you know, being superior about like, and I've run into this too where people will like on like my videos or wherever, they'll put out the most like batshit theories or like interpretations of something with like no evidence, but it's very clear they're trying to like, oh, I'm the smart one because I saw what the creator was doing, and it's like, bro, what do you no?
Like for me, like the curtains blue like argument is like, if you see blue like a bunch of times, like it's brought up multiple times, and it's always within this certain context, that's when I think it's fair to like analyze something and like be like, okay, no, this is obviously important for some reason, and there's reasonable like disagreements over this stuff, right? Like people can have like, no, it doesn't mean depression, it means something else, and I think that's completely fair. But I think when people try to shut down a point and basically be like, no, this is the only way to look at it in either direction, I think that's a problem. And even the Skylar White thing, which I'm gonna bring it back to, because we've talked about on this podcast before. And I brought this up recently. I did a Breaking Bad hot takes video, and I brought this up recently where it's like, um there are definitely dumb people who hate Skylar for kind of no reason, but I think there's also people who go too far the opposite way in like defending her. And a lot of those people will use media literacy. The reason I'm bringing this up is a lot of those people will use media literacy, and it's like yes, like she's not as bad as Walt. Like there's a whole bunch of evidence that's like, it's clear the creators are like condemning a lot of Walt's behavior. It's not meant to be a complete hell yeah, Walt, like you rock, like this is awesome. Um But I think some people cling to that idea and they take it too far, where it's like, oh, Skylar did nothing wrong, which I don't think is true. I think, like, with all characters on that show, there's she did make mistakes. She did do some bad stuff. She enabled some of Walt's behavior and is culpable in her own way. Is she as bad as Walt? Probably not. I mean, that's open for interpretation, but I wouldn't say so. But a lot of people, I think, like they take it a little bit too far. And again, a lot of that comes back to like media literacy. They're like, if you dislike Skylar in any way, you didn't understand Breaking Bad. And it's like, no, I can understand Breaking Bad, and I can still walk away with a slightly different interpretation of the character than other people do.
Yeah, and the Skylar White one is like it's always very and I think to some extent even like the Fight Club one is kind of difficult. The Skylar one in particular is difficult because most of like the anti Skylar White discourse is, forgive me for being like, blunt, but like is driven by a group of like a very small loud minority who are like almost insane, and like they're it almost gets to the point where they're like not it's not even a matter of like, oh, this is my interpretation of the media. It's like I feel like you're like allowing your emotions to like cloud your judgment. You're like, because like those are just people who were like, Walt did nothing wrong. He was just defending his family, and it's like, because and to your point, those are like the other direction where it's like, okay, hang on, like Walt, like Scott is such a bitch. He's just taking him down and emasculating him. It's like, okay, we can back off. Perhaps, or maybe like a better example to use would be say something like, if I'm watching a movie about a vigilante, um, I can enjoy that movie. I can maybe root for that character, and I can want to see that character get revenge on the people they're going after. And the movie might even be the message of the movie might even be, what's the saying, if you seek, if it is revenge you seek, dig two graves, whether it's Kill Bill, Death Wish, Death Sentence, whatever. um but that doesn't mean that like when I'm watching the movie that I'm like, that doesn't mean that like my personal philosophy is that actually vigilantism is okay, like what this character is doing is okay. It's like, no, because there's a disconnect between, we understand what we're watching isn't real, um and so we can root for this character and maybe even become invested in their journey without saying that we endorse what they're doing. And to your point, I think that's when you would get someone who's like, I can't believe you were rooting for this character even though they were doing bad things. It's like, well, don't, hang on, they're, it's like, like if I'm watching, I don't know, Boardwalk Empire, it's like, oh, you're rooting for this gangster who's a criminal. It's like, what's the matter with you? It's like, what do you want me to say? Like, I'm watching it, I'm just like, God, these fucking criminals. I can't even watch this show. They're all just so bad and immoral. It's like, what? Like,
No, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. That's the perfect way to describe it. A lot of, again, the media literacy types are like, they like to pretend that this stuff is only intellectual, where it's like, oh, I only watch Breaking Bad because it's a condemnation of Walt's behavior. And it's like, no, you are meant on some level to get a visceral enjoyment out of like this gangster stuff, or vigilante stuff. It's like, it's fun. You can intellectually be like, oh, that's like, I can condemn that or whatever, but like, it appeals and it's fun. And I think that denying that is very reductive. It's a very reductive way of looking at media. And you're right, there's definitely people who take it way too far, who it's like even if you like, I think there is stuff to like about Walter White and to enjoy about his journey, and even stuff that, like, I unironically think you might want to emulate that, when he like hits that guy who was bullying his son, like, like steps on his leg. That's a cool moment, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think, some people be like, oh, you should never use violence or whatever, but like, no, I think that, like, you are meant to celebrate him kind of coming out of his shell and like defending his family or whatever in that moment. If you think that he never took it too far, I think I would disagree with that personally.
well,
But
it's funny because you mentioned that, because that scene is in the pilot. It's like, because that's what's funny. It's like a lot of people, it's like, yeah, man, he started off okay and then he kind of went bad. It's like, But it's funny because every time, and to your point, every time I like rewatch Breaking Bad or I like kind of go through it, it is really amazing how that first watch, in a way, you can be very invested. But then the second watch, um, you realize there's this sort of like that undercurrent of Walt's actions of um, what it seems like he's doing for a reason A, but he's actually doing for reason B, or maybe there's kind of like a weird mix where he's not even really sure. Maybe he's like gaslighted himself into thinking that actually I'm doing this for this, but I'm really doing this for this, or maybe it's both. Because like even in that scene, obviously he wanted to, like, that dude was like, making fun of his son. Um, I do love, like, we were watching the Carrie remake. I love it how certain writers will like portray high schoolers as like belligerent sociopaths. Like in that in Carrie, like there's the scene at the beginning where she gets her period and she's bleeding in the shower, and all the girls are like, ha, 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 and they're like taking like videos of her, and I'm like, in what world do like, I mean, like, high school kids can be mean, but like these kids are sociopaths. I don't think I've ever seen kids act this cruelly, only in like teen movies, but yeah.
Well, no, finish your thought though about
Oh, my
Walt's
apologies.
motivation in that scene.
Oh, so obviously there is the uh the motivation of wanting to sort of like, stick to this kid who, you know, uh made fun of his son. But then of course there's also the sort of like the what's what I'm looking for? The undercurrent of him wanting to sort of that bully is sort of like almost like a representation of every person who's ever fucked with Walt in his life. Like even earlier in that same episode, which I didn't realize. I don't know if it's in the same in the show than it is in the script. The scene where earlier he's in the classroom and then that jackass student, like, he drags his chair making all the noise, and then later when he's at the car wash, it's that kid's car who he's watching. In the script, I don't think they mention his name in the show. Maybe they do. His name is Chad in the script, which is so funny. I'm like, that's so amazing. Um,
I'm pretty sure though that episode came out before the Chad memes though.
oh, I know. It was just funny. I'm like, Chad. I'm like, that's awesome. Of course, he's Chad.
Now here's my thing though, and you didn't say this, but let me kind of pretend that you said this. If you said that, like, oh, Walt's wrong because he wanted to assert himself over this person, not just to defend his family, but also, because it's satisfying to him personally. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think again, it goes back to this whole like pretending that like, oh, you have a violent urge, like that's toxic masculinity. Like that's you shouldn't be encouraging that. Like no, like of course we all have urges like that. Of course we all want to assert ourselves, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And again, we could have like various discussions about this scene because I didn't I thought it was all about defending his son. I didn't see any negativity in how that event was portrayed. Sure, there's other events where he asserts himself where it is very negative, like the whole "I am the danger" scene, which is a whole other can of worms. But I don't think every action Walt took throughout the show, where he kind of discovered his like rediscovered his masculinity and became assertive and stuff like that, was an inherently bad thing. I think like good for him for doing it in that scene. Like that guy deserved it. So I think there's reasonable people can have reasonable discussions about this stuff, but again, asserting that like only there's only one interpretation of this scene, and if you don't agree with my interpretation of it, you didn't understand the work. I find that very reductive thinking, regardless of even if it's something that I believe in, even if I believe in that interpretation, insisting that there can't be any other interpretation of it is stupid to me.
So I think, but then that goes, then that's, but then there's the, this is like where we're like in the middle, and then there's like the extremes. I think I agree with that until you start to, and like, then we can, in that case, we could offer evidence and make arguments and let people make up their minds. But then we get to a certain point where Um, and it's weird because there probably isn't like an actual line, but I think most people would agree that there's probably a line where that sort of argument, where like the interpretation argument, reaches almost like its limit. So, like a perfect example is, I would say, um, and so like a perfect example is every college dude douchebag you've ever seen, it probably had like a Scarface poster in their like in their apartment, or like any rapper, like they idolize Scarface, Tony Montana. Now, obviously, most people, if you were like, even if they like, yeah, Tony Montana, fuck yeah. If I were to ask them, it's like, okay, but you've seen like Scarface, right? They're like, yeah. And it's like, you get what that film is like, the point of that film, like if you watch the whole arc. Um, and they're like, yeah, of course, because, it's like he rises in the ranks, but then at the very end of the movie, he he loses his best friend, he loses his family, he loses his sister, he gets killed in a blaze of glory, and he dies. So the film isn't saying that, like, or like, here's a better way for me to say it. If someone were to tell you that um the Scarface is a movie, like, the point of Scarface, or what Scarface is trying to tell you, is that being a drug lord is like good, or like trying is like based, or like will lead to like a good life. That would be an interpretation where we might say, well, I mean, I guess you could say on some level, in the sense that, like, it shows you that you can get money and like women and cars. But when we look at or maybe maybe a better um, example would be, because we just talked about it, The Godfather with Michael Corleone, where at the throughout the you could almost like view the film as like, oh no, Michael's based. He's taking control. He's taking over his father's empire, and he's taking his father's enemies down, and he's asserting himself to the throne. And now, in a way, like, you could argue, like, just if we go by the facts of the film, it's like, okay, well, that technically is true. But then when we look at The Godfather and we're interpreting what is the film or the story saying, that's when it's like, okay, well, that's not really what the story. That's sort of like where the literacy part might come in, where it's like, if I were to actually like tell you the events of The Godfather, just like the events, you could view that story as like a triumphant story about a son who takes up his father's honor and defeats his enemies and becomes and fills his father's station. But that obviously is not what the film or the story
But
is trying to
here's
communicate.
the thing, though, and the film can say what it wants, but it's up to each of us to interpret. Like, the interpretation is our own. Like, we get to decide what a work means to us personally. And even if your opinion doesn't, like, you can't articulate it, or you can't maybe present evidence in a way that convinces other people, like, I don't believe in, like, objective, this is what something is. Like, it's a piece of work. And again, I'm not saying that, like, I would agree with any of these, like, wacko fringe opinions about a thing. I would be like, oh, it doesn't, like, to me it doesn't mean that. But again, I think that interpreting a work is so personal, and, like, it's meaning, like, the only meaning that exists is your interpretation of it to you, right? Like, I don't know if we're even arguing at this point. I don't know if that's going against what you said exactly, but
Uh,
I don't like the people who are like, there can only be one way to interpret this. Like, this is like, even if you don't agree with their interpretation, I think that, like, people are free to believe what they want about a certain thing. Now, if they argue that this is the only way to interpret it, sure, fight against that. Fight, like, like, argue against it, because they're making an argument in that case. But if you came away from Scarface or The Godfather feeling triumphant and being like, oh, this is something I would want to emulate, well, that's your fucking decision. We all have our own values. And there's plenty of people who have done stuff like that in real life, right? There are drug lords, there are people who betray their families to do whatever. And it's because that's their values and stuff like that. So, like, from your perspective, like, analyzing the work, it's obviously you don't want to be like Scarface. I don't want to be like him either. But there are people who do, and I don't think that they're their view is inherently wrong. Like their actions might be to me, but that's in accordance with my values too. So I don't know if I have the right to impose that upon their views.
Well, I think because I think we're kind of almost rolling in a couple things. I think we're rolling in a one. I think we're rolling in death of the author, and we're also rolling in objectivity versus subjectivity. So, for example, probably a good example of I think what you're talking or what example of what you mentioned is say the Game of Thrones finale, which was almost I would say universally panned. Almost the vast majority of fans agreed that it's almost universally agreed to be a bad ending. However, there were many voices after the finale who came out and said, well, actually, just because that was the big line, just because it didn't do the thing that you wanted to do, doesn't mean it's bad. And so then the question arises of like, okay, well, and so we can touch on death of the author, but for this, we can use it as the example of objectivity and subjectivity. Then the question would be like, okay, well, so is the Game of Thrones finale bad? And if you were to pose that question to most, um, so if I were to like adopt your viewpoint, the viewpoint would be it's like, well, most people agree it is, and they have X, Y, Z reasons as to why, but that doesn't necessarily make it bad because there are many people who viewed it and actually thought it was a proper conclusion to the show or thought it was a fitting or and the characters were um
And being bad is also that's not an objective like thing. That is a completely subjective opinion.
yes. But then the question is like, and this is like where the conversation gets interesting. When we're talking about something being good or bad, are we talking about something like ob- some sort of like objective measurement, or is that measurement we're talking about simply popular consensus? And in most cases, usually, if we really break it down, it almost always comes down to popular consensus. However, then the question, like a level deeper, would be, well, why was that? So, like, what I mean by that is like when the vast majority of people, it's again, I don't want to exaggerate, but I think I can safely say that it seems like the vast majority of fans who were very invested in Game of Thrones and very liked it and were really excited for it agreed in their view that the ending was bad. Now, just because the even if it was like 95% or 99% of the fandom agreed with that, that doesn't necessarily mean the show was bad. But then if we go a level deeper, then the question is like, okay, well, but why did that elicit? It wasn't like, there are certain, I've seen finales that are what's the word I'm looking for? Polarizing, if you will. But this wasn't polarizing. This was almost very starkly negative. So it's I think the point I'm getting at is almost like there's a weird like it's almost like we keep flirting with it where it's like we're trying to grasp an objective measurement, but we almost can never. But then I'm afraid of the other response where is like, well, it's all subjective and it's never not good or bad. And then it's like, well, I don't know if I believe that either. I'm really see, I'm
I do
stuck
believe that
somewhere.
because again, the word what do you like bad is not a scientific like this is not science. There's no like measurement for bad or good. Even like doesn't popular consensus doesn't negate like opinions about the thing. And I'll give you two great examples from you and me both. Your opinion on The Departed.
Yes.
You presented a very good argument for why The Departed is flawed that 99% of the population does not agree with. I've never seen any critic ever bring up the points you brought up. I mean, the critics have brought up flaws with the film, but like the vast majority gave it like incredibly high scores. So by that argument, your um dislike of those elements of the film is not valid because other people don't bring those up. And a great example for me would be Lalo Salamanca.
No, sorry, my
99% of the Better Call Saul community loves Lalo Salamanca and they hate that video I did on him. but I don't think my opinion was wrong or invalid. I think I presented some very good arguments for why his presentation was very flawed in Better Call Saul. Just like I thought your video was very good about pointing out the flaws of The Departed, even though I still love that film. So I think that I do agree. Everything is subjective. There is no objective thing because art is not science. Art is its own thing, and yes, we can have popular consensus, and yes, we can have like things that like seem really obvious to us, like the Animal Farm argument or whatever. But at the end of the day, we're talking about made up fairy tale bullshit. It's kind of like arguing theology in a way to me a little bit. And people like there are people who dedicate their lives to like really understanding what religious arguments are and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it's all made up stuff. I mean, if you believe it, fine, all power to you. But we're arguing over nonsense here, and I know you and me both do that as media content creators. Um, but it is all just made up nonsense.
Well, I think that's what's like. It's funny because like I completely agree with you, but actually, there's actually two interesting things I want to bring up. The first is I completely agree with you, but and I don't know why this is. There's still something where I'm torn on to pull that trigger because if I were to pull that trigger, then I would have to objectively say if I were to take say The Godfather as a film or what's that movie? Was it superhero movie? Remember
Yeah, yeah, I know what you're talking
the
about.
really
Yeah,
bad one? You could, I mean, the objective view would be to say that these two films, neither one is better than the other. It completely comes down to personal preference. All you can really say is that the majority of people
yeah. Yes,
view A as better than B.
yes,
Um,
that is factual statement.
that is a factual statement, but then the question, like, and I try to go like a level deeper. Then the issue for me is okay, but then I'm trying to understand where does that disconnect come from? What is it that draws? Why would so like again? If it is all subjective, completely subjective, up to everyone's opinion, but why do 99% of people hold that opinion? Now it could be for certain objective elements of the piece of media, or and this is I will completely agree. This is completely true in a lot of film. There is a measure of what I'm looking for uh, there's probably a term for it, but sort of like popular consensus, following the crowd. It's like why Citizen Kane is the greatest film ever because everyone says Citizen Kane is the greatest film ever, and there absolutely 100% is a lot of that, particularly in the history of film. Um,
I agree
yeah.
with what you're saying though, that like there is some kind of system, right, to art, right? It's art is not just a series of images. Like film is not just a series of images and sounds thrown together randomly, and it's just a random arbitrary thing of whether it's successful or not, right? There is a method to the madness. And there's stuff that like like the majority of like culturally we value in storytelling, and that can vary culture to culture, right? Foreign films, like people could watch that and be like, oh, that's a pile of trash. Like Americans could watch a foreign film and be like, oh, that was a pile of trash, because it doesn't conform to the style of storytelling we're used to, and vice versa. I'm sure there's plenty of other countries who they watch The Godfather and like, this is a piece of shit, right? Like there was no musical number in this. India might be like, there was no musical number at the end of this film. What the
You
fuck?
totally could have put one in the Sicily sequence.
Yeah,
You guys,
exactly.
you guys fucked it.
Yeah. So again, there can be a method to the madness, and I think that it's fair to point out when something doesn't conform to that, right? If like if a story doesn't resolve in a way that we kind of expect stories to, we have a right to point that out. Now, where it gets tricky is that there's stuff that it doesn't conform that way for a reason. David Lynch doesn't do the normal storytelling thing for a reason, and it works for him. But someone else could do the exact same thing. It could be like, oh, this is horrible because he doesn't have the kind of intentionality that David Lynch has. So
Well,
I'm not arguing that there's no method to any of this, but to like objectively say that like, oh, this is the only way to do it or whatever, I think is there's no truth to that.
And to add to your point, and this will like really like fuck with people's heads. And I there's no way you could this would ever happen, but it would be really cool. To your point about David Lynch, then the question becomes, how does notoriety affect impression? So what I mean by that is, I show you Mulholland Drive. Hey, this is a David Lynch film. It's awesome. You watch it. Oh, I love it, man. This is awesome. David Lynch's total style. Well, what if I were to show you that film and without you knowing it was a David Lynch film? And of course, in this day and age, it's almost like virtually impossible. But I'm very curious as to how it would have been received if people didn't know it was a David Lynch film. Or in any case, take any Scorsese picture. If you took that exact same movie and you took his name out of there, um, would you feel the same way about it?
You
And
you also have to factor in also too like the time that the movie comes out in, right? There's plenty of movies you can like old movies you can go back to and be
yes,
like, "Oh, this sucks by our standards today." But that's a false like it was really good and like memorable at the time period because this is what the culture wanted. And I'm sure there's plenty of films that come out now that we love a lot that in the future are gonna be like, "Oh, this is like it reminds me of the Back to the Future scene where they have the old arcade machine in the future, and it's like you have to play with your hands. It's like a baby's toy.
yeah,
So like I'm sure there's gonna be stuff like that in the future where people are gonna be like, oh, this sucks by our standards today. But you had to kind of at least try to take things as they came out back in the day. But again, you're also free to form your own opinion, right?
yeah.
There's plenty of old movies who, I still think even by their standards, it wasn't a great film. Um, or I would have done something differently even back then. But again, that's just my opinion, and I wouldn't try to like force that on the media, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's sort of like part of the reason why Citizen Kane is um revered even today. I mean, I think it's a very strong film even in itself. But when people talk about it's the greatest piece of cinema ever to hit the you know, ever hit the screen, one of the main reasons for that is because in context, it like created cinematic language as we know it today. Like everything in that movie, and like when you watch it today, it's like, oh, I've seen tons of movies do this. It's like, yeah, but this was the first movie to do like 90% of it, and it was all in one fucking movie. Like, to think of being like a director when that film came out and you're watching it and you're like, what the fuck am I watching?
And you talked
Um,
before about how people say they like it because it's popular. There's also people who don't like it because it's popular, where it's like, fuck this movie because it's like it's way too overhyped. Like people do that so much. They're like, can we finally be honest and admit that The Godfather is not a good film? And it's like, again, I don't want to I don't want to say that opinion is not valid or whatever, but I think if you're only making it because it's popular and you hate on it because it's popular, well, that's not a great mentality to have going into analyzing a work.
but then of course the question is that how do you know? Because like when I recently watched Lord of the Rings films, um, I will like to say that I gave them a very objective reading from my
Yeah,
own perspective.
yeah,
However, I can't ignore that for the last 25, if
yeah,
not, I mean, like I'm 31, but like, if not at least 20 years of my life, these
yeah,
films have been in my ear and I've seen them everywhere and I've seen people talk about them and say they're the greatest pieces of cinema ever. And it's like, so I can't say that, like, even when I did try to give them an objective reading for the movie, I can't say that didn't like,
yeah,
it's like I'm thinking that like it's like going to a restaurant expecting like a meal that's gonna like cure cancer,
mm-hmm.
and then it's like it's a really good meal, but you're like, well, it didn't cure cancer, and it's like
Yeah,
to what? How do you? Because
yeah,
there is a sort of like a backlash of if you set your expectations way too high, then nothing can ever meet them.
yeah,
There is something to be said about that, and it's
yeah,
difficult because it's how can you can try and be objective, but you also can't control that about your
yeah.
emotions and stuff. Um, Oh, sorry. And then the second point I wanted to bring up, which was it's very interesting that you bring up the whole like culture war thing because um at least for me, and you can agree to disagree, but it seems like the people who are more on like the media literacy side tend to skew more left liberal,
Yeah.
would you
Oh
say?
yeah. Yeah.
And the
100%.
people who did sort of like get away from that are on the other. What's very ironic about that is that if we, and this is sort of like a very clear indicator as to how much culture war bullshit is not really based on logic or principles, but just sort of like teams. If we flip it and talk about modern art, I see a lot of more liberal left leaning people when we're talking about like art, like paintings or
Mhm.
sculptures, they'll look at modern art and they'll say, yeah, we're deconstructing art. We're trying to like break it down and what is art and be very like postmodern about it. Whereas the other side will be the people who were like, oh, so you're telling me the Mona Lisa is isn't any like, better or worse than someone took a shit on the floor at an art gallery? It's like, well, by that metric, if we're talking about like there is no objectivity, it's like
Yeah.
that is technically true. It's just that the
It
Mona
is.
Lisa just happens to have more cultural relevance, not
Yeah.
because it is objectively better by any sort of metric you want to make up, but just because people consider it to be. And
Oh
there is a
yeah.
dissonance there where it's like, and again, because we're talking about like these, a lot of people who like have these beliefs aren't really, they're sort of, um, it's just all
Yeah.
team sports basically. Um, And I agree to some extent where I think that modern art is interesting in the sense that, you know, what's the I think it was the artist who put a toilet in the gallery
Yeah.
and everyone's like, this isn't art, this is bullshit. It's like, yeah, but it's generating an emotional reaction out of you,
Yeah.
right? That's the purpose of art.
Yeah.
But then, and I understand that, but then there is a part of my mind that does look at something like the Sistine Chapel and someone taking a shit on an art gallery floor,
Yeah.
and there's something in my mind saying it's like, well, no, the Sistine Chapel has to be better than
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
right? And it's there's a weird, and I recognize this in myself. There is a
Yeah.
weird dissonance in myself where
Yeah.
I recognize what you're saying completely, but there's
We
something in me that still resists for
we
reasons I don't know.
now art is subjective, but like there is stuff like the amount of effort that something took, which can be much more objective, right? The Sistine Chapel took way more effort than that, shitting on the floor. But it's subject like its analysis of what it meant to you is completely subjective. And a great example, let me just say that like what means more to you? Your favorite episode of South Park or the Sistine Chapel?
My favorite episode of South Park, of
Yeah,
course.
which took more effort?
Probably the Sistine
The
Chapel.
the cha No, of course it did, yes. They shit out those episodes in a week. It's
Yeah.
good, it takes effort, don't get me wrong, but my point is that, like, the amount of effort that goes into something does not determine its emotional relevance to you.
And or to some or to expand on that, or to some extent, does um not necessarily equate quality. Because like one of another controversy we've seen a lot is like you can't shit on this movie because so many people worked super hard on it. It's like, well, sure, but they made a shitty movie. It's like it doesn't well, at least in my opinion, if you will. So yeah, there's to your point, it's like we almost have to make up criteria to fit our yeah.
Yeah, and listen, I know I've been kind of like the one saying like it's all just opinions in this episode. I don't
It,
mean to say that like you can't like you have to preface everything by being like this is my opinion, and I know it's not everyone agrees with me. And I don't want to offend anyone. Like if you want to say like this show sucks or whatever, that's totally fine. I don't mind people having opinions, and they don't need to state it. They don't need to pussyfoot around other people. My problem was when they be like this movie is shit and this is the only way you can look at it, and if you don't think it's shit, you are wrong objectively. That's what I don't like, and that's what I push back against. And speaking about the culture war stuff, yes, most media literacy people lean more liberal, and they use that to be like, oh, you're a conservative, but you like South Park. These guys are liberal, right? Like you completely misunderstood the work. if you're conservative and you like South Park, because Matt and Trey hate people like you, and it's like, one, I don't think that's true, but even if it was, that this is why I'm saying that like objectivity, there's no objectivity. Like I can like a piece of work regardless of the creator's politics, even if politics is a part of the message. I understand David Simon's opinions about the drug war. I don't necessarily have to agree with them to like The Wire and appreciate The Wire as a piece of art.
Well, so that's perfect that you said. I'm so glad you said that, because then this is where we come back to, I think, death of death of the author, and this is where this comes in. When we're talking about media literacy, are we talking about? And this isn't like I'm not like asking. It's like I'm just sort of proposing it. Are we talking about something where like what my interpretation of the media is, or am I, or like what is my own personal interpretation of the events, or am I trying to sort of imprint, or am I trying to gauge what the creator is trying to say? So again, an example is the Godfather. You could make an argument where it's like, well, when I watch the film, it makes me feel very empowered. It's a story about a man who embraces his heritage, takes over his family's empire, destroys his enemies, and comes out on top. Which, objectively it kind of is. So you could have that emotional reaction to the story. But if we're looking at like, okay, but what is the author trying to say? What are they trying to communicate in the movie? You could still argue, you could still make the claim that even though that's not how I view the film, I can understand that's what the creator is trying to. I can understand the message they're trying to get across. That isn't necessarily how I am interpret. Well, because but then this is where we kind of get into a weird, we get into like a weird dissonance where, and again, this comes back to death of the author, where it's like, okay, so what is paramount? Is it my interpretation of the events and what the story means to me, or should I should I be talking about what Mario Puzo or Francis Ford Coppola, I guess, what message they're trying to convey with this media? And then if I have that opinion of the media, does that make the creator wrong about what they created? Or there's even, I think another couple of another good example of um the whole media literacy debacle is Watchmen, where a lot of people will point out like, hey, Alan Moore, um, he's been clear about what his piece of media was trying to say. But then others have pointed out, which to some extent I agree, that even if Alan Moore says that, if we actually just take the text of the novel itself and ignore his comments, well, that doesn't necessarily, you could interpret it a different way. Like, I think The Godfather might be a bad example because there are like very explicit, like if we look at the film, there are very explicit, filmmaking cues that make, the ending is like, this is a bad ending. And like, there are many, we could talk about that for a while. Um, but if we look at Watchmen, it's like, well, why? Oh, so Alan Moore doesn't like Rorschach, but you could interpret Rorschach being the quote unquote hero of the novel, depending on what your philosophy is. Depending, even if two people disagree, you could argue that he is the quote unquote hero of the story. But then the question is like, okay, so should we completely disregard what Alan Moore's intentions were, aka embrace death of the author? Um, and then to your point, okay, but then the question is like, okay, then what does media literacy even mean? Are we trying to argue an objective point? Are we just seeing which side is able to formulate a stronger argument? It gets very messy very, very quickly. I think it's a fascinating. I think it's more fascinating to talk about than it is to actually partake in, to be honest.
No,
Yeah.
and I think that's a personal decision. For some people, they do want to like try to think about like what did the author specifically mean with this, whereas other people, it's just like what am I taking away from this? What am I getting from it? And I think I think both of those are valid. And again, it comes down to your own personal opinion or whatever of like what you like and what you value. And I don't. I'm kind of losing track of where we are in the argument. I don't know if I'm arguing against something you said or we're agreeing
I
with something
think
you said.
I think it's very purposeful. I think it got to
Yeah,
a point where because again, I think we're kind of both in like sort of like
yeah,
this like we're again as like these are the extremes. You and me are kind of like we might
yeah,
not be eye to eye, but we're kind of stuck in the middle where we both see each
yeah,
other's point, and we're both sort of like because this in particular, like we're talking about death of the author and media literacy, reading comprehension, all this stuff, objectivity versus subjectivity. There's really no, ironically, the
yeah. There is no
that's
objective, like,
there's no
yeah,
objective. It's all yeah. And yet it's almost as if we as a society, because again, you could make the same argument for morality. There is no moral, there is no objective morality. However, I would agree, or you would presume that the 99% of people on the planet, if you said, hey, is it okay to like, kill a baby or something? It's
yeah,
like, well, most people would be like, no. It's like, oh, but morality's subjective, right? And that's where we kind of get into this. There's almost sort of like, maybe it's not the right term
but
for me. There's almost like an instinctual element to it
yeah,
when it comes to like media object. Like, if is this movie good or is this movie bad? If you were to again, if you were to show me The Godfather and superhero movie, I'm like, of course The Godfather's better. Like, what are you talking
yeah,
about? How can you even argue
yeah,
the opposite? But then if you were to then ask me, well, why? Like, can you actually give me
yeah,
like a concrete reason? I'm like, I mean, I could say, oh, well, the cinematography, like this,
yeah,
yada yada, yada, but it all comes down to, at the
yeah.
very base level, a subjective experience.
And I know we're getting really deep into philosophy here, but like
It's fun.
at the end of the day, like you only interpret the world through your perception, right? There's a whole philosophical concept of like the phaneron, which is like this idea that like everything you experience is filtered through your mind specifically, right? And it's like if you're blind, right? Sight is not a part of your world. Like it doesn't exist. Even it might be a part of mine, but to you, you don't experience that. So it's a completely meaningless phenomenon. And so ultimately, like we're all each in our own subjective world, right? There's another belief called solipsism, which is that the idea that you cannot prove that anything in the world is real besides yourself, right? There's no way to prove that I'm not a figment of your imagination, that you're locked in an insane asylum and you just think that you're recording a podcast with me every other week. Um, because you can only ever experience your own, point of view. You can't see through my point of view and you can't see yourself on the screen there as I'm looking at you. So ultimately everything is subjective, and my greater point with all of this was to just argue that like I don't think you can shut people down for their beliefs, and I don't like it, especially like again going back to the culture war thing, like if your beliefs, if you disagree with the creator's opinion or their political views or whatever, you can still like a piece of work. That was the main thing I was arguing against with the media literacy people. It's like you can be conservative and like liberal media. Most media is going to be liberal, more liberal. And that's not a conspiracy. That's just the fact that like people, if someone goes into the art field, they're more likely to be liberal than conservative. That's just who kind of gravitates towards art as a concept. Whereas, I'm not to say it's impossible, but that's going to be the more likely phenomenon. So you can completely have political beliefs that go against a piece of work and still appreciate it. It doesn't matter what the author says. It doesn't matter what some annoying people on Twitter say. You're not wrong for that, and I don't like that discourse around it. So that was the only thing I was kind of arguing against on Twitter when we were talking.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because now I'm thinking of it. It is funny how it is framed as a culture war thing, but then when you turn that onto the modern art again, to bring it back up, the modern art discourse, it's almost flipped, where it's the other way around. So it kind of does come down to team sports. Although it is funny where it's almost like you make a good point where there are plenty of films that I've seen where I agree with the message there, and funny enough, this kind of goes back to, the whole, woke discourse, where there are plenty of films where the message of what the film is trying to say, or the politics, or the apparent politics, I agree with wholeheartedly. But I'm like, this movie sucks. Like, you guys are like doing this in like the worst like way. And then on the opposite, I've watched a number of, because it is kind of a guilty pleasure for me, a lot of like Christian propaganda films. And obviously, I do not agree. Like, I'm not religious at all. I don't agree with that. But I'm almost like, I really wish I could see like, what if they just made like a really well made, like, because all of them are like just very badly written, and just badly made. But I just wish, like, what if you actually did make like a really kick ass, um, like like Christian propaganda film, and it was like objectively like excellent. Well, I guess not objectively, but
Passionate or not Passionate Christ, Last Temptation of Christ. Scorsese made one.
yeah, that's a good point. I am like, I completely I completely disavow this entire thing, but I am actually really into the story, and I
Yeah,
actually
I mean,
really
a
enjoy
lot
this
of
film.
media though is like based on Christian, like, not ideology, but Christian like imagery. Like the Christ figure
The
is a
Christ figure.
central thing in like the resurrection. It's like a central thing in a lot of like everyone likes to point out how the Matrix is like Neo is Jesus, right? That is
Mhm.
essentially what the film is about, and not literally, but like it's copying the same exact motifs, and it's so a lot of media is arguably Christian media.
Well, and what's funny enough, you mentioned that it's even more interesting is when we actually, because you mentioned like talking about like conservative versus liberal media, but when we actually like look into certain media, well, it depends on how we define, liberal, conservative, modern, postmodern. Like, to some extent, you could argue that any film where, so say, take something like The Godfather, you could argue that in a way it is, or even Scarface, you could argue in a way that there is sort of like a conservative take on it, because this person does bad things and they end up paying the cost. That, like, karma ends up, a postmodern take on it would be the bad guy gets away and nothing happens because there is no God and there is no good and evil. But a very huge staple of most, at least Western storytelling, is the good guys win, or the bad, and that's more of, I guess you could say, like a modern take, which is, to your point, greatly influenced and inspired by religious and Christian theology.
Yeah, but
So,
it's a mistake that people make where they're like associating conservative like political conservatism with Christianity. Like those like yes, there's
that's
a
a good
lot of
point.
conservative Christians, but the issue is not fundamentally like you can be liberal and Christian, you can be conservative and atheist. Like there's a whole again, people are way more complicated than a lot of Twitter discourse would make it out to be.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's just it's a whole thing.
Just as a funny note we can end on, I just Googled, like, because you brought up a good point about like conservative versus liberal media, and I Googled like, what are the best conservative films? And someone mentioned Juno, which is, remember Juno with Elliot
Oh yeah,
Page?
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
it's like, what has it? It's like, well, she keeps the baby, doesn't she? She goes against. I'm like, but yeah, and then now it's like, and it's funny too, because like that movie is like the most like hipster movie you've ever
Yeah,
seen in
yeah.
your
You can
life.
tell it was made by a bunch of Seattle,
Yeah,
sandal wearing people. Yeah.
but
So
it's funny.
yeah, I mean, interpretations can be weird. It's like, and again, I think it's I don't think most liberal peoples are like raging like abortionists like the like the conservatives like to make him out to be. Like just because I don't think just because you're pro-choice, you're like yes, yes, like do it. Like it's the way again we like to make these straw men out of the other side. Like again, most conservative people are not like frothing at the mouth racists. Most liberal people are not. Whatever they're portrayed as. It's like it's weird how people we like to what's the word uh like cartoon like make people cartoons make people into caricatures essentially.
You know what we should do as an experiment, just like to put a cap on this? We need to find someone who has never heard of Animal Farm and knows none of the context to read it, and then I want them to tell me what, because I almost wondered, to go back to the whole death of the author. I almost wonder if like, because like, when I was reading Animal Farm in high school, if my teacher didn't tell me what everything like represented, I probably would have been, unless I had like like a massive education on like the Russian Revolution and like the Soviet Russia. I probably wouldn't be able to pick up on a lot of it. And I
No,
almost
I mean
wonder like,
you wouldn't get like the Soviet specific imagery, but I think a normal person though would get that like, oh, this is about politics and power in general. You might not know the specifics of the war, like the communism or whatever, but like
you
you
get the
would
more
get that it's a,
universal.
yeah, you get it like and I think it works on that deeper level. But that would be an
Okay.
interesting experiment to see.
And that goes to the point of another, again, we won't go into it, obviously. I know we're running late, but um I know that's also another um contemptuous topic when it comes to allegory. Where should something work in terms of like being is something being allegorical to something else a defense of certain choices or narrative choices? Or should the story, whether or not it is an allegory for anything, stand on its own? And I think that's also, I think it's an interesting argument too.
Yeah, so I think
Like
that's a good.
fucking like fucking
Yeah,
Gandalf in fucking Lord of the Rings. It's like, oh well, he's a Christ figure. I don't care.
yeah,
He should have stayed dead.
exactly. So I think that's a good place to leave this on. Thank you all for listening. I know this is probably a weird episode because it's like I don't know if we were arguing at all during this or even disagreeing at all. It's kind of sounded like we were just talking around these points in the same way.
God forbid two people just discuss a topic at length and try and see each other's perspective, man? God forbid.
What's funny? I was part of this podcasting group a while back where we would just talk about podcasting and like share tips and stuff like that. And we did this thing where we showed everyone one of our episodes. We'd listen to it and we'd like it's like a book club kind of thing. And I showed them our episode, the one we did about the MCU.
Okay.
And there were two pieces of feedback I found interesting. One was that the person said that you and I agreed with each other too much, like we were very similar. And he's like, it would be better if you two were more opposites, like Hannity and Combs on Fox. If you ever saw that show back in the day, but like it was a conservative and a liberal, like vehemently like disagreeing with each other the whole time. It was much more entertaining because it's like they're arguing and stuff back and forth versus you and me are kind of we just agree with each other 99% of the time.
Yeah, I'd say we're pretty much on the same page for most of it. Yeah.
But the other feedback I got, which is so funny, going back to the whole culture war thing, was like, um, we talked about wokeness or whatever. Specifically, me, I think I said something about being woke is bad or whatever. And someone was like, "This." Like the second I heard you say that, I turned off the podcast and I refused to listen to any more of it. And I was like, I didn't say anything because like I'm really nice to people like when we're talking one on one, but like I was like, okay, fair enough. I don't, that's completely you're right. But I was like, that is my that is a statement about the culture war and
Yeah, that's
politics in
not.
general.
Well, it's a shame too because it's like I mean, again, we won't go into it, but like the whole woke thing, it's like for me the issue is more of like it's, and to your point about this whole conversation about like subjectivity, the issue for me is the fact that like if I'm talking about you and you're talking about something woke, I think I know what you mean. We've spoken enough where I know what you mean. The issue is then I go somewhere else and this person says woke and they mean something completely different and it comes off as like really weird. And that's when it's like when we're trying to use this term in terms of discourse, I'm like, what are we even talking about? And then it becomes, it's like you have 100 people who like think they agree, and in reality, they fucking all could not disagree more. And
No, and that's the hard part is like I'm sure if he listened to more episodes and we talked about this stuff more, I don't think he would disagree with what I was saying. Just like I don't think you do. But
no, but you're just you said the word, so now you're
I
a
know, he
bigot.
just said the word, but I also understand that, like, it's not like you're not gonna watch, like, 6 hours of a person's podcast to understand what they mean, like, a random person you don't even know, right? You're gonna go off of just
Yeah,
what you see right there, and it's not everyone's responsibility to do hundreds of hours of research to kind of figure out what you mean, and so I get
but
that,
I
but
but I would say like in your defense, I think like you were pretty reasonable in your takes. I think like for like the more like the sort of like anti-wokies who I usually shit on Twitter, these are people who are like within like 2 or 3 minutes of any video of theirs, you can tell like it is very clear what is like what they're, it's they're not coming off like a reasonable, well-measured person. They're coming off as a very and then to your point about the sort of like Hannity and Combs thing, while I agree it is fun to watch that, then the question becomes, well, how much of that is actual performative? How much of this is two people if we actually had these two people sit down and actually try and, come to some consensus on what they believe and what they agree on and disagree on, would that be better for society? Maybe. Would it be nearly as entertaining? Probably not to most people, but
No, but I mean, at the end of the day, all that matters, right, is like entertainment, getting those views. No, I'm just kidding. I don't believe in that. You don't believe in that, which is why we don't ever make like these shitty like clickbait videos about like rage bait or engagement farm or anything like that. Like it's honestly not even a philosophical thing. It's just too much work. Like it sounds exhausting
I want
to do
to.
the performative stuff.
Dude, I wish I could. I wish you know how much money is in that? I wish I had the pay. There was I think I there's a person on my Discord who made like the best quote ever. I did not say this, it was them. It was probably my favorite quote ever. It was um I could what did they say? It was something along the lines of like, I could be making millions of dollars um making like anti woke, progressive content on YouTube. But no, I had to be the one person in my family who doesn't hate gay people. Yeah. And it's like, I really wish I just had no principles and I could just again, it's not even the principles to your point. It is like really when I see like the channels who have like multiple uploads a day just like raging at shit, I'm like, bro, I thought I was a hater. But man, I cannot that would just drain my soul. Oh my god.
This is a completely separate. I know we're way past our time, but like we can maybe talk about this another episode. But like I don't disparage the people who do that, even though I wouldn't do it. It's exhausting to me because I know people gotta you gotta make money, right? You gotta do what you gotta do to support yourself and your family or whatever. So it's like, do I like a lot of this type of content? No, but I get why it exists. I'm not above that kind of stuff. Like we all gotta make our way in the world.
Depending on your it's weird because like it depending on your view, you could almost argue that like if you view it as if you just view entertainment as a commodity, your view is not to it's almost amoral. You're just like what video can I make that will get the most clicks? And if this is the thing, then it will do. I almost like to think that because I will hate on a lot of these people myself. But one thing that does come from me is to think that I almost wonder, in your view, how miserable an existence it would be to sort of like create a channel like that and like make those videos and none of it is something you actually agree with. Like you're just performing and you don't actually agree with it. You're just grifting. And maybe some people are okay with that, but I'm almost wondering of like how taxing on your soul must that be to like know that like you have to do it to like to your point, like to provide for your family or make money. Like this is your bread and butter. And even though you don't agree with any word that you're saying, you have to do it to,
Yeah,
keep doing it.
I gotta imagine most of them. It's not that they 100% disagree with it. It's probably just not as they have those beliefs. It's just probably not as extreme as they make it out to be. But I would counter how taxing is being broke. Like how taxing is worrying about your rent payment or whatever. Like I'm sure that's like everything in life has a cost, right? And it's like we do what we got to do in accordance with our values or whatever. And everyone has their different values, but I don't know. That's a whole other can of words.
Well,
We're way past our time here.
if you ever see me making like hardcore, if all of a sudden you see me making anti woke content, you have permission to
No,
like
you know
DM
you
me.
that wouldn't work for you though. You need to make the opposite. You would need to make like woke like being like Trump is bad, okay, type content, and
See, I couldn't.
I would need to make the anti woke content.
See, I hate Trump, and even that shit bugs me. I'm like, oh my, like what was it? The whole like when SNL had Alec Baldwin on. I wanted to fucking die. I was like, "Oh my god."
Maybe don't separate families at the border. Maybe like I hate that comedy so
I
much.
hate that comedy so much. As someone who agrees again, as someone who agrees with 100%, I hate that comedy. Ah,
So anyway, thank you guys for listening to this. I know we rambled on and on, but stay tuned for the next episode coming soon.
take care, y'all.